20th century Reformation scholar Heiko Oberman makes a very, very helpful distinction here between what he calls tradition 1 and tradition 2. And he says when you look at the Reformation, we can't really read the Reformation as a blanket rejection of tradition. There are different kinds of tradition. And tradition 1, for Oberman said, is the tradition of doctrinal formulation that is closely tied to and justified by reflection of exegesis of Scripture. So, for example, we might say the doctrine of the virgin birth. The traditional teaching of the church on the virgin birth would be, Oberman would say, that's an example of T1. It's an example of what Paul's talking about when he says, pass on a form of, hold fast to the form of sound words, pass on the teaching, pass on the tradition. There's good tradition. You think about this instinctively, most pastors do operate with some form of tradition. If you're preparing a sermon on a Sunday, typically speaking, you won't just stare at the page of the Bible and hope for enlightenment. You'll pull your commentaries, maybe your systematic theologies off the shelves to help you understand what the passage means. Oberman would say, that's a good example of tradition 1. And the Reformers were comfortable with tradition 1. When they're attacking the church tradition, what they're attacking is the notion of what Oberman calls tradition 2. And that's the tradition of dogmatic or doctrinal formulation, which stands somewhat independent of biblical exegesis and rests for its authority more upon the magisterial, direct teaching of the church. So if the virgin birth, for example, is an example of T1 kind of teaching, we might say the immaculate conception of the Virgin, the idea that she was conceived without original sin, the immaculate conception would be a sort of a T2 doctrine. Now, I know, a very good Roman Catholic theologian like Matt Levering would try to make a case that you can justify the Immaculate Conception on the basis of Scripture. I'm not persuaded. For the sake of argument, let's not get into the sort of the deep weeds of that. But by and large, there are two kinds of traditional teaching. That which rests closely on reflection of exegesis of Scripture, that which rests more directly on the magisterial claims of the church. So hold that in mind. I want to supplement that a little bit. I want to say that Oberman is, I think, correct there in his analysis of tradition in the Reformation, but I think we need to add one further dimension to it. And that is we need to add a sort of a cultural consciousness aspect to this, which I think is critical. And that is the Reformers, by and large, operated with what I would call a hermeneutic of trust regarding the past. One of the hallmarks of teaching this week on the rise of modern selfhood, and one of the things that really characterizes the 20th century is suspicion. Suspicion of authority, suspicion of tradition. Suspicion is something that is in the very air we breathe, cynicism and suspicion. For the Reformers, that's not the case. I might say, well, how does that affect their approach to tradition? Well, I would say this, that the Reformers, by and large, accepted tradition as T1 unless it was self-evidently T2. They accepted the historic teaching of the church unless it became very, very clear that it wasn't justifiable by reflection on biblical exegesis. It's an interesting, when you think that's quite a significant way of thinking about theology. I remember during the heat of the 2016 stuff, somebody said to me, well, how do you justify eternal generation? And I said, well, in my world, I don't have to justify it. It's the traditional teaching of the church. You have to prove it's wrong. That's where the difference lies. And that's a difference in some ways in cultural mindset. And the basic assumption of the Reformers, I think, is that the doctrine of the Trinity is part of T1. It's basically taken as a kind of given that should only be modified as and when it is demonstrably incorrect or inadequate.